Okay.
Deputy Smith? What's the ratio of time sharing?
10 to 5.
10 and 5 it is, agreed.
So you would look at it on paper and say an additional allocation in this budget is very, very welcome indeed. And I want to just query some of it, and I specifically want to query the additional budget in relation to the Traveller Initiative, where funding is increased from 855,000 to 2.2 million. And I want to find out from you, Minister, if I'm not here at the end to hear the answer, I'll check back on it tomorrow. But in 2015, the National Traveller Partnership budget of 1.2 million came through the Department of the Environment. This year, that funding stream was transferred to your department, along with the National Network Funding, SNOs, Support for National Organisations, which is normally allocated to the ITM, the Irish Traveller Movement, the National Traveller Women's Forum and Pave Point, and that was also transferred to Justice, and is approximately 200,000. This would mean that where the difference between what we did have for Traveller Initiative funding and what we do have is possibly made up of a transfer of funds from Environment to Justice rather than extra funding, because Environment would have spent the 1.2 million on the Traveller Partnership budget and the 200,000 on the National Women's Forum, the Irish Traveller Movement and Pave Point. So can I ask to get an answer, please? Is this increase on paper, or is it an actual real increase and not just a transfer from one department to the other? And does it, for example, include the funding for local-based national organisations under the National Traveller Partnership, which had as well been under the Department of Environment and is now transferred to Justice? We know that there were previous claims of great increases in spending in the area of, generally in the area for travellers. For example, that the housing budget was increased to 4.2 million. You could say that's not directly your responsibility, but given that you're the Minister responsible for equality and that travellers tick all the boxes for suffering extreme inequality in this society, that 4.2 million was lauded as a great step forward in terms of traveller accommodation funding, but in fact it was omitted to acknowledge that the funding for traveller accommodation in 2008 had been in the region of 40 million. So that omission of acknowledging what you're coming from and going to makes things look good, but in fact they're still very dismal. And they seem to remain to look dismal from the funding point of view, Minister, for travellers, and that the cuts implemented during the austerity years on the travelling community were indeed, and I think practically everybody with a heart in them acknowledges this, that those cuts were the most vicious, the deepest and the most heartless that it was possible on any aspect of society, and the travelling community took the hits most. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of a withdrawal of state funding over the past 5 years. Interagency activities, and I was on the LTACC in Dublin City Council for traveller accommodation. At the beginning, we very much relied on the interagency model. That was cut by 100%. Traveller education by 86.6%. You may as well just tell the kids to go home and play on the site, because there's no point in educating them. Traveller accommodation was minus 85%. Equality minus 76.3%. And the traveller organisations cut by 63%. Now, I guess, Minister, you're probably discussing with your officials there that this isn't really your brief, but actually your brief is equality, and all of these cuts, the most vicious, the most humane, the most cruel cuts, have led to and increased a deep inequality of travellers versus the rest of society. Travellers tick all the boxes for low life expectancy, low infant mortality rate, poor health, poor educational attainment, and the suicide rate, for example, among traveller men is 17 times that of the suicide rate among the rest of the population. So there's been an extraordinary level of disinvestment by the Irish state in the travelling community. One of the most striking aspects of these was the statutory agencies didn't even spend what was allocated to them. So the years that I was on the LTACC in Dublin City Council, for example, there was an underspend of several million on housing in a period when travellers, like the rest of the population, were going through a housing crisis, because many travellers rent private accommodation. Like the rest of the population, were losing that private accommodation because of soaring rents, and we're ending up in the homeless agency. So I'll just again give you a few figures. The underspend on health in that period was 18%, on equality was 28%, and accommodation was 26%. So a lot of what I am talking about may be in different budgets, in different departments, but ultimately, Minister, you are responsible for equality, and I think we do need to look very carefully at what has happened to the Irish travelling movement, particularly in the years of austerity, and how we're going to address that, how we're going to, for example, restore special assistance in normal mainstream schools to traveller children. A school in Bluebell which had its special assistance cut, 2 of them absolutely just disappeared because there was no budget for them, and yet that school takes on the bulk of the traveller population from Ballyfermot and the surrounds, and many of whom end up doing very well, but not because your department or the education department or anywhere else is a great help to them, but because mainly of the dedication of the teachers, their parents, and the determination of the children themselves. So at the moment, in terms of traveller accommodation, and I think this is something that the Cabinet needs to address, given the terrible tragedy that happened last winter, where 5 young travellers lost their lives in a dreadful fire, and I think that the state needs to look at this on an equality basis, not on the basis of throwing a few crumbs here and a few crumbs there, but actually addressing the deep inequality that exists. And that's why later on in the year we would hope to pursue this by pushing for a legislation that recognises travellers' ethnicity and therefore would legally bind the state to dealing with them on an equal footing as they do the rest of the population. And just one other question for you before I shut up is to do with the integration and asylum and migration budget, because from what I can read into it, it remains the same at 1.5 million as last year, 1.5 million this year. And yet we are supposed to be taking in extra refugees from Syria and from war-torn and famine-stricken areas, and that doesn't match up to any commitment that we may or may not give to asylum seekers coming into the country. There's a slight increase in the Immigration Service budget, but that may be just to help the Irish Immigration Services Board run by An Garda Síochána to process people faster. Does it really deal with delivering a budget that will help us look after the needs of asylum seekers and their families? So there are a couple of things that I find challenging about the estimates, and I'd be very, very happy to have your answer on that, albeit that I might be just moving slightly outside of your brief. But at the end of the day, I'll just repeat it, at the end of the day, as Minister for Justice and Equality, all of the, holistically, all of the issues to do with the lives and livelihoods and the lack of equality for travellers ends up on your lap, and I think that we really do need to address this and stop visiting desperate inequality and tragedy on the travelling community.
Thank you, everybody. Seamus Healy.